Welcome to the Intentional Success Podcast, where we unpack the top strategies, explore business trends, and drill down into best practices to help your live events production business grow and scale on purpose. I'm your host, Tom Stimson. In today's podcast, I'm going to explore the consequences of transactional thinking and tell you what you can do about it. Have you ever encountered a rule for a problem that just doesn't really matter? Or a rule that was made because one thing happened that one time? You know, imagine ordering dinner at a restaurant. You go to the restaurant and said, "Hey, I'd like the eggplant parmesan," and the waiter says, "How would you like that prepared?" And you stop for a second. He goes, "No, seriously, step by step, tell me. Because we had a customer once that didn't like the way the chef made it, so we always ask now." And then you find out that the waiter has to place the order correctly, or the kitchen will come to a dead stop and complain that sales never gives them the information that we need. And if this starts to sound a little bit like your company, guess what? Rental mentality, where we all came from, has a lot of rules that don't matter anymore. And many of those rules manifest in the software we use and the processes we follow, and they're historic. And I want to kind of, bang up against them a little bit today and share what the pandemic, which thankfully is over, has re-taught us about making money, because rental mentality made us a lot of money back in the day. And when I say back in the day, I mean a really long time ago. But the past 20 years, rental mentality has been holding us back, and we got a chance to break that cycle, and I want to dive into that a little bit. So, some things that rental mentality has done to us. And I've heard that, literally this week, talking to customers, checking availability on equipment when quoting is a rental legacy. If you are a rental company, availability is important. But most of my audience, you do events for a living. Rental is just a piece of the transaction, and it is a transaction. It has nothing to do with doing shows. Availability has nothing to do with doing shows, because you're going to get what you need to do the show. That's what show business is. So why are we checking availability when we're building a budget for a job that we have not even won yet? And yet this still happens every single day in production rental companies. Now, quoting, building a quote and listing specific equipment by make and model so that when you win the job, the warehouse will know what to prep. Again, at the quote stage, why does this even matter? Well, how do we know what to quote? We have to look at our inventory. We want to use inventory. If we don't use our inventory, wait a minute, this is transactional thinking. And then that also leads to adding every single item you could possibly need up to the quote, including all the cables, parts, and accessories it takes to put the job on, effectively building a warehouse prep order just so you can quote the project for the client. And I'll addend to that, people who have to create a drawing or a 3D rendering in order to quote something for a client. So in case we miss anything, well, what if we miss a rigging point? Who cares, right? You haven't even won the job yet. What is the job worth? So all of these things I'm describing are very common transactional steps that have no value to the customer in a project-based world. And I would also argue they have really little or no value to you as an organization unless you are still operating transactionally and trying to do projects by bolting a bunch of transactions together, which is really kind of insane. So let's shift gears here. If you can sell a job for $100 and only spend $50 to deliver it, then you made money, right? We all agree on that? There's $50 left over, you made money. Hey, that's 50% gross profit. Does it matter what the costs were? It only matters in the sense that maybe you should have made more money. And rather than assuming that your costs were too high, maybe your sell price was too low. So could you have sold that for $110 or $150? Could you have sold it for $1,000? Okay, now we're talking real money here. So in the pandemic, we actually got a taste of learning how to sell this way, where we know there are going to be costs incurred. We have some idea of what those costs are, but we're really focusing on what the project is actually worth. And what led us there was the fact there were so many things about what we were selling that we didn't understand, that we assumed there were more costs than we knew about. And so we were padding our numbers, our sell price, to make up for the things that we don't know. How awesome is that, right? So we learned how to price things that actually had no transactional value. So a rental unit or an hour of labor has a transactional value. It's easy to calculate, right? Things like streaming platforms, using your Zoom license, post-production equipment, editing time, studios, all of these things were kind of new to us in the streaming world, and we didn't know how to charge for them because what's the transaction? I don't know how many discussions I had about how much should we charge for our studio. I see this guy's charging $500 a day, but these guys charge $5,000 a day for their studio. What's my studio worth? Is it based on the list of rental equipment that we have in the studio, or is it based on the list of rental equipment that is actually used on that particular day? And what I found myself explaining to many of my clients, that a studio for pre-producing videos that are going to be used later in the live event is not a rental item. It is not a transaction. It's actually never a charge that the client should even see, because it is a tool to get to a deliverable, which is a finished video. It is something that you schedule, but the value is actually in the output. Does a carpenter rent you their hammer? Or do they rent you a finished wall, right? They sell you a finished wall. So the whole idea of renting a studio was very comfortable because it was a transaction that we're familiar with. But in all practicality, it made no sense to their customers. I don't want the studio. Oh, I don't want to pay for the things that I'm not using in the studio. And it just created a lot of uncomfortable conversations, right? Another thing we had to learn how to sell were venues. You say, well, wait a minute, we weren't selling venues. It was all virtual. No. Streaming platform is a venue. Or the studio for a live stream is also a venue. The client could do that in a hotel. The hotels were empty, but you could still run a ballroom. They could do it from their office, or they could do it from your studio, which is now the venue. And this is an example of where you could rent the studio, but in reality, what you are renting out is a list of capabilities and amenities, which include the studio space. Right? So we could put a price on that and say, yes, we can provide you this venue. It's $10,000 a day. It comes with these capabilities, but you're also going to need these capabilities that are additions to do your specific project or event. So we had to learn how to sell ideas instead of just selling items. And it was a great experience, because what the pandemic did was force us to sell something we didn't fully understand and had never priced or even sourced before. Now, the good news is at the beginning, April, May 2020, June 2020, we had a safety net, right? You had laid off or furloughed most of your employees. You had some folks left over. You were getting some government subsidy. So you didn't have a lot of risk here, and you had time on your hands to figure things out and try things. So the folks that you kept back during your initial days of the pandemic were backed up by government money. Your gear was sitting idle. You had a lot of time on your hands, and you were selling streaming events. An event is an event, right? Right? Just because we're not loading a truck or walking into a convention center doesn't mean it's not an event. It was still an event. So we tried to sell them the way that we'd always sold events, which was transactionally. And initially, we kind of underestimated what it was going to take to do things, and we over-delivered on what we sold. But what else were we going to do? I mean, we had time on our hands. We had resources available. But in that process, we learned about pre-production and planning and what happens to well-laid-out plans when you're dealing direct with the client weeks or months in advance of the show, where things blow up on their end. Oh, we're not going to roll that product out. Oh, that presenter's not going to be there anymore. Oh, we've changed the theme. And all these things that we didn't really get to see before, we're now in the middle of it. And it's affecting the work that you're doing that you thought you were going to do at once. We thought that pre-producing a video that's going to be presented from a record during an event was also an event. not realizing that we were going to pre-produce that video, we were going to record that video, we were going to create bumpers, graphics, and animation for it, intros and outros, touch up the voice and all that, and then we're going to have to do it over when the messaging changed, right? But we didn't price it that way. We priced it as if it was a one-time transaction like a show. When it's over, and it's over. But that's not what pre-production really is. But the good news is my clients would tell me, hey, that show went great, but it took 150 man hours before we even did the event. Clients aren't going to pay for that. I can't charge them for 150 man hours when I can't even tell them what we're going to do. And I'm thinking, well, why not? Do you not know what you did with those 150 hours? I mean, even if 50 of them was researching stuff that you'd never done before, there's 100 hours that you can account for that were delivering value, because what you did is actually what it takes. And maybe you could be more efficient, but some of those hours were producing, recording, editing pre-recorded videos, coordinating presenters, developing a 3D animated GIF for the client's logo, adding bumpers to the recorded videos, setting up a website for attendees to enter the portal. There was a lot involved, and it all had value to the customer. And once that kicked in, once we realized that, things got fun, right? So by August of 2020, my clients were saying, hey, these streaming events are awesome. I got 70 to 90% gross profit. Yeah, my warehouse is full of gear that's not working. We just covered it up with drape and made it a studio. But we can just make up a number and the client agrees to it. And I'm thinking, weren't you just making up numbers all along anyway? I mean, when did we ever think that the numbers that we were giving clients for our transactions had any basis in reality? They're all made up numbers. But we had created a paradigm of value in those numbers by saying this transactional value of this video projector is $500 a week. And we convinced our clients that that's how those things were sold. So what you learned to do in 2020 was to associate value to the things that you actually needed to do. So what is the value in all that pre-planning? Because what's the deliverable? The deliverable is a better event, and this is what it takes to have a better event is pre-planning. So that means that the things that you need to do that the client finds no value in are either a waste of time or they're the cost of doing business. And we can't charge the clients for wasting time, and we can't charge them our cost of doing business because that's what gross profit pays for. But I digress. What I came here today to do was to bash job costing, and that's really what I want to do is bash job costing for a little bit, at least in how we have traditionally used it. So the point of job costing is to look backwards so that we can see what we did so that we can reduce over-delivery and undercharging. These are good things. Job costing has a good deliverable. It tells us where we over-delivered. It tells us where we undercharged. It serves the same purpose now as it did before, but selling streaming events during the pandemic showed us job costing in action. And here is what we learned. We learned, and this is good, that we over-deliver a lot. And our over-delivery is worse the more time we have before the actual event, right? The 6 to 8 weeks of pre-production, we over-deliver infinitely as opposed to the kind of over-delivery we can do on 3 days on show site. 3 days on show site, we're going to over-deliver. But man, you got 6 to 8 weeks, you could really over-deliver. We also underspecify our scope of work. We assume that the limits of the technology or the deliverable are self-evident. We don't spell those out. Therefore, when there's a surprise or a change, we don't have any way to control the scope of work. We end up having to do things again for free because we didn't describe what the finished work is and what happens if the client wants to redo it. We learned that a lot of our sales folks have been using job cost to cut margins and pass the savings on to the client instead of raising margins by capturing more value. In other words, our job costing was actually having the opposite effect on salespeople. We told them how to cut costs so that we could charge the client less rather than how to cut costs so that we can increase pricing so that we can make more money. We also learned, as I've alluded to, that prices don't matter, right? What matters is value, the value of what you're selling to the customer, and their budget. Price is what the customer pays for value, and they won't pay more than their budget, right? And that's a paradigm that we really hadn't thought about in those terms before. We learned that how we get to the price is not as important as how we get to the cost. We know that cost plus margin equals price, but more accurately, we learned that price minus cost equals margin. In other words, if something is worth $1,000 to the buyer and it only costs you $5 to deliver, then that is a fair deal. Okay. And as you are doing right now, we learned that we feel guilty about markup because we feel that we don't add any real value when we source products and services for our projects. And that's ridiculous. First of all, when you source for your customer, you are assuming the risk. You need the expertise and resources and the knowledge to find the supplier and vet them to make sure they know what they're doing. You are acting as the bank. And you have to have the resources to do this on call 24/7, 365 for your clients. There's overhead in what you do. So we should never feel guilty about markup. We should never feel guilty about margin because you're putting a huge amount of money at risk of not being recovered if you don't. And then we also learned that the less clients understand about how to make things work, how to make it work themselves, the more valuable we are to them. And as the pandemic began and all of a sudden, all of our clients were laid off and the people who'd been buying from us for years were no longer employed. And then when people did start buying from us again, they were completely unfamiliar with what we do, our terminology. They probably weren't even show or event people. They were just the folks who had it dumped into their lap who were still employed and they had to get the job done. So they really relied on us to be the experts rather than our old clients who were very often considered themselves the expert and controlled how we do things. These are the guys that are ordering the eggplant parmesan prepared the way that they want it prepared rather than the way your restaurant prepares it. So let me summarize what we've learned from all this, or what we should have learned from all this. Number one, you need to know what things should cost you. That's still very, very important. But what's more important is know what they are worth to the buyer when you put them all together. So the items that it takes to do a deliverable, the individual items don't have value to the buyer. Okay. Therefore, they should actually never see what those things cost them. What they should see is what the output of those things are. And if that has value for the buyer, if a well-run show where all the speakers are heard, all the speakers are seen, it's recorded, it's streamed, the content is clear, okay, if that has value, the client will pay for that. The parts and pieces to put it together are just the tools in your toolbox that it took for you to get there. So we also learned that if you sell smartly, like I just described, then job cost is helpful to make sure that you buy correctly. Because it's one thing to sell, but it's another thing to buy because you have to put all the stuff together. And when we had gone from 60 employees down to 5 employees and we're having to outsource everything on the job, we were a lot more careful about how we bought because our job costs were going to be higher than what we would normally expected because we're using outside labor in particular and maybe some outside resources because we're using tools for streaming that we might not have owned, or we had to go out and buy them. Amazon did great during the pandemic because we were buying so much stuff to try and do business from home. Another thing we learned, and a very valuable lesson, is that the minute you hear or utter the words, but the client won't pay that, know that you have slipped back into a transactional thinking mindset and that you need to regroup, and you need to regroup around value because you are now focused on a transaction. And I don't care if it's the client will pay $250,000 for this entire show, which doesn't sound transactional, but we sell value. The client has a budget. Does our value match their budget? Give them the price and we're good. So the self-talk that we create, which comes out of transactional thinking, guilt about margin, okay, insecurity about what we don't know, and that legacy of job costs causes us to project onto our customers thoughts that may not actually even exist. So don't catch yourself saying, but the client won't pay for that, and stomp on that as quickly as you can. Regroup, shift the conversation to value. You'll be okay. And then finally, stop showing the buyer your math, right? Today's buyers don't understand your math anyway. The old buyers did, and they leveraged it against you extremely effectively, but your new buyers generally don't understand your math. Show them the math they need to see. Show them their math, okay? Here are your options. Here's how you can increase this value for yourself. If that's not valuable for you, don't spend that, right? Here's how to spend your money wisely. That's the math that they need to see. They need to see what their choices are. They need to see what your recommendations are, and we need to work on that relationship instead of the transactional relationships that we lived in for years. So that's what I have to say today. I hope this is valuable to you. Now go out there and please make some well-deserved profit. You've earned it. Go get them. If you want to find out more about today's episode, go to trstimson.com/podcast, where you'll find the show notes, related links, and tons of other valuable resources. If you haven't already subscribed to the Intentional Success Podcast, please do so, and I'd greatly appreciate if you would rate and review the show. Also, if you think you might be a good fit to work together or want more information about the Stimson Group, I'd love to hear from you. Visit trstimson.com for more information.